What is going on with the LSAT exam? You've seen the news, you've seen people talk about the LSAT exam. Is it going away? Is it ending? Should you throw out your books? Spoiler alert, you should not throw out your LSAT books. How can we best understand the changing LSAT situation? For those of you who are new and don't know, my name is Sydney Montgomery. I am the founder of Montgomery Admissions Consulting, where we specialize in working with first-generation and minority law school applicants. In the midst of everything, last week, of course, we talked about the change in rankings, like schools pulling out of the rankings, and what does that mean? But it seemed like the very next day, there are all these news reports about the ABA voting to end the law school requirements that they use the LSAT exam or really any other exam. And understandably, some of you have been in my inbox, in my DMs, and you have questions. You're like, what does this mean? What does this mean for me? How does this change my law school application cycle if I'm applying right now? What if I've already applied? What if I'm applying next year? Is next year going to be harder or more confusing? What about the year after that? What about 2025? Some of you are just trying to get your life together. You're just trying to plan your life and you have questions and you want answers. And so I'm not going to be with you very long today, but I did want to kind of clear the air a little bit about what this means. And it's always so interesting because I do both college and law school admission consulting. And so there's a lot of ways in which law school admissions is this tiny little bubble and we're just kind of all in this echo chamber. But there are a lot of ways that what is happening in law school admissions is not that dissimilar to what is happening in college admissions and other graduate school admissions. And we can learn a lot about what will and probably won't change by looking at the trends in admissions in other areas. Because while we would all like to think that law school admissions is a special unicorn, special snowflake, special butterfly, all the things, law school admissions is not immune to some of the other trends and factors that happen in other areas of admissions. So first off, for some of you are watching and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So the ABA has been taking public notice and comment, and it has been really wrestling with this question of the LSAT, the law school admission test's role in law school admissions. For those of you who've been following it for a long time, you may know that last year, the ABA voted and said that all 50 law schools could start also accepting the GRE instead of the LSAT exam. Now, here's a really important note about that. All of the schools, all 150 law schools, right, they can accept the GRE. Not all of them do, but they can. So the ABA is not saying every school must do this. It's just saying, here are some permissible rules for you. To give you more context, when COVID hit, most undergraduate schools went test optional, right? People couldn't take the test, they couldn't take the SAT, people were losing their jobs, studying for the ACT and the SAT just wasn't really top priority in the middle of a global pandemic. Understandable. And so most institutions who had not already been test optional, because some college institutions have always been test optional or who went test optional, many years ago. But everyone, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, everyone, basically all colleges were yeah, you know what, high schoolers, it's good. It's good. You're good this year. Don't take the SAT or ACT. It'll be fine, right? And they all kind of went test optional in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Law schools were not allowed to do that, really, because the ABA required that all of its member law schools have a standardized test as part of their admissions process, except for some very few instances. And some of those might be 3+3 programs, which is when you do kind of maybe 3 years at your undergrad, you get fast-tracked into that same school's law school. A lot of times the LSAT exam is waived in those instances, or there are some other smaller caveats. But for the most part, all law schools, for the majority of their applicants, had to require a standardized exam. So they weren't able to just say, oh, it's COVID, we'll go test optional, right? That was not an option available to them. And in response, the LSAC rolled out the LSAT Flex, right? This online at-home thing. Because if you have to take an exam, and understandably, we are in the middle of a global pandemic, something has to be done so that you can take an exam. So that's where we got the LSAT Flex, which is now just the LSAT, and it's at home. It wasn't at home before COVID. Now it's at home. Will we ever return to taking the LSAT in person in big groups? It's really unclear. But that's kind of what happened, right? The LSAT came at home. And last year, the ABA said, you know what, law schools, we have heard that some of you have already started using the GRE. And we think that's fine. We think that the LSAT or the GRE is fine. Now, I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying ABA said it was fine for you to take either the LSAT or the GRE. And now they have voted to say, you know what, law schools, you don't really have to have a standardized test. Now, here's the first piece that I want to clear up. This is not a final decision. This vote still has to go up for a larger vote in February to the ABA House of Delegates. That's important because they could say no. It's likely to go through, but it could not. So I think that's the first thing that I want to clear up, is that this is not a done deal. It's not a done deal at all. They still have one more vote to do in February. The second thing is that they actually snuck in a little addition to what they voted on, and they've decided that it's going to start 2025. So first off, if you were applying to law school this year, if you're applying to law school next year, if you're applying to law school the year after, right, like it's actually not going to affect you. So I think that we as humans, we love drama. It's very exciting. But unfortunately, like this does not make your application cycle any spicier this year. And I love a good law school admissions drama, right? But like this is not it for those of you that are applying to law school this cycle. Just carry on. Business as usual. Nothing is changing because again, even without that provision, they still have to vote on it again in February. So it's not going to affect your admission cycle anyways. But they have specifically said that it would not begin, this test optional permissive landscape would not begin until February or until 2025. They wanted to give law schools time to decide and time to do what they do, because there are humans that work in law school admissions. They also, while I think they maybe like less drama than I do, they have to run a well-functioning organization, and it takes time to figure out, like, are we going to go test optional? Are we not going to go test optional? What does that look like? What other criteria are we going to use? How are we going to evaluate applicants? All of these things, right? Like all of that takes time. So they're not even going to start until 2025. The ABA is not saying, law schools, you cannot use the LSAT. This is very important because people hear, oh, test optional. The ABA voted not, that law schools don't have to use the LSAT. Goodbye, LSAT. And like, that's just not realistic. So some schools will go test optional, I'm sure. And some schools will not, at least not right away. Even look at the landscape right now. There are many undergraduate schools that have gone back to requiring the SAT and ACT. Some schools just love them a good test. It's how their admissions processes work, and then they believe in it and they stand by it and they think that's the best way that they can evaluate candidates. And some schools are like, hallelujah, test free, right? Test optional. There are a lot of arguments for and against test optional, right? And I think this is one of the most interesting debates in the legal community because there are about 80 plus law school deans who wrote a letter to the ABA basically stating that if they supported a test optional landscape, it would actually hurt diversity. The deans are saying that some schools, in lieu of using the LSAT exam, would use other factors like GPA and factors that are more prone to bias, and also factors that don't account for the lived experience of many first generation and lower income students who maybe had to work while they were in school, or who had a rocky start to the beginning of their undergraduate degree, or who have taken significant amount of time off, right? So if like your undergraduate GPA was like 20 years ago, they're saying that they believe, this group of 80 plus law school deans, which honestly, it's a very wide range of schools, like schools in the top 10, schools in like everywhere, right? They feel like without the LSAT, schools will actually rely more heavily on measures that hurt diversity and diverse goals. They also say that because of the rankings, which is an ironic argument at this good moment, given that, schools are dropping out of the rankings left and right. But their argument, they couldn't see this coming, was that because of the rankings, schools will face tremendous pressure to go test optional. So, the argument that just because the ABA says you don't have to accept the LSAT exam or you can go test optional, right? Like they're saying, well, if I as a school want to keep using the test, I'm going to face pressure from all of my other friends and all of my other member schools that are accepting the LSAT exam, right? And so or not, right? And so if they're all going test optional, then I will go test optional too, because I want to make sure that we have good standings in the rankings. I think that argument's a little weak given what we're seeing with the rankings right now. So I want to focus again on this diversity thing. And LSAC, the Law School Admissions Council, their argument, and all of these arguments are not without merit. Their argument is that by removing the LSAT exam, it makes it more likely that schools will admit students that will be unsuccessful in law school, thus taking out more unnecessary debt, right? Your law school is very expensive. If you cannot graduate, pass the bar, make more money, it is actually a bad investment in your future. So these are kind of all of the reasons for why people and law school deans and respected legal professionals are saying that no, the LSAT exam is a really good thing. It is also a predictor of bar passage. I think the bar exam is flawed, so I'm not as swayed by that one. But given, that the bar exam is still in play, right? If we dismantle it all and reimagine a completely new future, sure. But, given that the bar exam is still in play, I'll give them that argument. And of course, there are diversity arguments on the other side, that the LSAT exam is one of the largest barriers to underrepresented students accessing a legal education, not by design, but actually by the fact that there is such a large tutoring and capitalist economy with the LSAT exam, right? And so that those that can spend more money and more time, because the LSAT's graded on a curve, right? So those that can spend more money and more time studying, who maybe aren't working while they're studying, who maybe can pay for private tutoring 4 times a week, whatever, are at a higher advantage than those who are working and using free resources. And that the playing field is not actually level. All I will say is that the median LSAT score for Black applicants is still hovering around 142, which is a problem. I'm not going to say why, but it just that fact is a problem, right? When you look at where most schools are taking, when you look at where most of the medians are for most of the top 50 law schools, and then you look at where the medians are for most BIPOC applicants, it's not really adding up, right? So there are very valid arguments for and against why having the LSAT in play is, helpful or harmful to diversity. But what I actually want to focus on, though, is what's happening right now is actually really not a question of whether the LSAT exam is helping or hurting diversity. I would argue that it's really a question of personal agency and also permissibility. There are a number of people, many applicants, who have lower GPAs, right? And so there's this argument that the LSAT exam can help someone that has a lower GPA prove that they are ready for law school. There's absolutely nothing in the ABA's ruling allowing schools to go test optional that would prevent someone from taking the LSAT exam to prove that they are academically qualified despite their GPA. And I think this really boils down to the law school admission world not fully understanding the difference between test optional and test blind. So we will borrow from our college undergraduate peers. Test optional means you have the option of taking this exam. If you have a 4.0 GPA and a 145 LSAT, maybe you don't submit your LSAT score, because that would not help your application. But maybe if you have a 2.9 GPA and a 175 LSAT score, you submit your LSAT score, because it is going to help your application. Test optional means you, as the applicant, have the option to submit what you feel like best represents who you are as an applicant. It is not the same thing as test blind. Test blind, which some undergraduate colleges are in the US, I highly doubt any law schools will go test blind, at least in the near future. Test blind means we're not going to consider your LSAT exam. You can send it to us, but we're gonna avert our eyes. That's not what anyone is actually saying or proposing. So this concept of the LSAT going away is misplaced, because in reality, even colleges that have been test optional for decades, every year still have people submitting the SAT or the ACT. So I have no reason to believe that law schools that choose to go test optional are just going to have 0 applicants submitting the LSAT exam. I believe what's more likely is that students for whom the LSAT benefits them will submit the LSAT exam, and students for whom the LSAT does not benefit them might not submit the LSAT exam. Or they might submit the GRE, which honestly, you as an applicant have the power to do now anyways. There's a question, what do you think about the GRE? Do you think most schools will accept their GRE and their acceptances? I mean, the ABA has already said that schools can accept the GRE. A lot of schools accept the GRE. Most students still take the LSAT exam. And there are a multitude of reasons for this, but applicants actually are given more choice in this test optional landscape than less. And honestly, applicants currently do have a solid degree of choice right now, often not exercised. I do not think that every school is going to go test optional right away. I think that in a world in which the rankings are somehow still here 2 to 3 years from now, some schools will be definitely incentivized both directions. If you as a school become test optional, what we've seen in the undergrad landscape is that test medians go up. So if I as a law school go test optional, what's likely to happen is that my LSAT median is going to go up, because only students who feel like their LSAT represents who they are going to submit their LSAT score. That makes sense. If my medians go up in a world in which the rankings are still relevant, probably my ranking will go up. And so there may be some law schools that are very incentivized to go test optional because they'll be able to raise their medians while still taking in well-deserving students who have strong GPAs and no test scores. There is also this thing that happens usually with admissions where people tend to assume what is more likely. So if I'm an admissions officer and you come through my desk and you have a 4.0 GPA and really strong letters of recommendation and work experience and strong essays, I'm not going to assume that you would have gotten a really low score in the LSAT. I'm going to assume that you chose not to take it because you have a 4.0 GPA, and if you had taken the LSAT exam, it probably would be comparable to your GPA. Like, people don't assume that the least likely outcome is what is truth. People assume that the most likely outcome is truth. And so I might reasonably feel confident accepting you because everything else checks the box, so probably your LSAT would have if you decided to take it. That's usually how admissions, especially at least on the undergraduate level, kind of deal with students that take the exam and students that don't take the exam. We look at other factors, right? Likewise, though, if you're 2.3 GPA and maybe you don't have really great academic letters and you choose also not to submit the LSAT, I'm not going to assume that your LSAT score would be good. I'm going to assume it's not going to be very good. Now, I'm probably wrong, but I'm going to assume that your LSAT score would be comparable to your GPA if you're not submitting it. That's just, as a human, probably what's going to happen. There are some students for whom submitting the LSAT score will help break my probably erroneous assumption. And you can say, listen, that GPA doesn't reflect me, but look at my LSAT score. It's so great. So it's just going to kind of offer more flexibility and more choice. But none of this is going to happen until 2025. That's really key here. All of this conversation about applicant choice and what schools will go test optional and what schools won't go test optional. Will any schools go test blind? Probably not. Like, how will this affect things? We're not going to know for at least another 2.5 years. By then, maybe the rankings will have died. But who knows, right? But by then things definitely will look different. And so I think that's really important to understand. But I do think that regardless, even if we woke up tomorrow and every school said for next application cycle, we're all going to go test optional, the ABA says, yep, let's do it right away, I would still encourage everyone to take an LSAT diagnostic exam. And you might be like, why, Sydney? The LSAT's the bane of my existence. Why would I subject myself to that? Because you don't know what you don't know. You might have a baller LSAT diagnostic exam. Like, studying for 3 months to get into the 170s might still be the very best thing for your applications, even in a test optional landscape. It's quite true. You cannot assume, oh, I don't have to do this, so I'm not going to do that. The name of the game is still like, how can I strengthen my application? But for those of you for whom the LSAT literally is the thing standing in your way, and if not for the LSAT, everything else would be beautiful and shiny, then yes, I think those are the people that would most benefit from a test optional landscape. But for most people, I hate to say it, you're probably still going to end up studying for the LSAT exam, just like most students still end up taking the SAT and the ACT, even in a mostly test optional landscape, because you want to give yourself options. You want to at least try, right? You want to at least see, what is my free diagnostic score? If your free diagnostic score is a 125, it might not be worth it for where you're trying to go. But if your free diagnostic score is a 158, oh my God, 10 more points, 12 more points, and you'll be in 170. That's worth it, right? And I think we need to start making some of those decisions based on, what are my goals, where am I trying to go, where am I starting, and is it kind of worth it? Like I said, do college admissions, and I have all of my students take a diagnostic SAT and ACT exam, and then we decide which exam makes the most sense for you, which one do I naturally score higher on, and are either of these, with reasonable amount of study, going to be comparable to my GPA? Or will my test score always be significantly lower than my GPA, such that I should probably apply test optional and go off the strength of my GPA and academic record? These are the questions that we will have to ask ourselves in a test optional landscape. But thankfully, again, not questions that we have to ask ourselves now, or at least for the next 2.5 years, because nothing is happening at least until 2025. So hopefully this was helpful. Let me know if you have questions. You can always submit questions at bit.ly/breakintolawschool. I know it can be really confusing and really stressful, and I know there's probably no shortage of things on Reddit. I avoid Reddit, so I don't know what's on Reddit, but I have no doubt that Reddit is active and abuzz. But run your own race. Don't get distracted by all the noise, because half the time it's just that. It's just noise, it's just chatter, and you have to just ask yourself, like, what's actually going to impact my life today? And for many of you, it's not this. Do not stress about the LSAT, and I will see you guys after the holidays.